Michael Moran. I'm the Chief Risk and Sustainability Officer at Microshare, which is a company that does data for the built world, smart facilities, et cetera. But my background in journalism and then subsequently in financial services and risk management really pushed me in the direction of sustainability and ESG, which is a big portion of what you might call the pre-COVID business that the company I'm working for now was engaged in. It was really about outfitting inert assets, buildings, brick and mortar, and giving them vital signs, creating data feeds that prove that these things are actually alive, that not only the actual structures, but every thing inside of it is performing some function that is measurable. It is consuming energy that is, of course, measurable. It is affecting humans and affecting the environment in measurable ways. That, of course, is where we were pre-COVID. And I like to say that people would often, listen to myself and our data scientists and our product developers politely. We tended to be pretty clever and personable people. But it turned out, in most cases, this was a nice to have for the big built world. Suddenly, they're aware that what goes on between the walls of their facilities is not just a nice to have. This is a matter of life and death for some people. And it's a matter of reputational and liability concern as well. This is a game changer. In effect, what I'm hoping to do is think about COVID in a spun forward, optimistic sense. It's a terrible, tragic event. It was predictable. It was predicted, in fact, and it has happened before. One of my former colleagues from the Council on Foreign Relations, a woman named Laurie Garrett, spent the last 20 years being called Chicken Little. And lo and behold, this happened, and we were not prepared. And we're surprised. And even the most intelligent of us sometimes look at COVID and think, wow, well, this is once in a lifetime. The pandemic of 1918, and now we have this in 2020. So I guess it's just a once in a century thing. Very parochial, very self-serving attempt to kind of brush this under the table as an oddity. It's my belief that this is a game changer in many ways. It's a very painful moment. We're all tired of it. To quote a great American intellectual, COVID, 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 COVID. It's all supposed to be gone November 4th, right? Lo and behold, it's not. In fact, it's gotten worse. The work we've done at Microshare to try to determine what you might call the duration of COVID in an emergency sense, relevant to the businesses we serve, we believe this will be very relevant all the way through 2021. Vaccine, God bless the inventors and distributors of the vaccine, but it's not going to bring herd immunity within 6 months. It's going to take time, even in a developed society that handles this cogently and competently. And I, of course, am talking about the rest of the world, not the United States. So ultimately, I wanted to take a moment to just think about COVID in terms of, it's something of a cliche, but the crisis that we can't waste. Obviously, it's often attributed to Rahm Emanuel, but he stole it from Churchill. And Churchill, I'm sure, stole it from Machiavelli. It's a tremendously Machiavellian concept that, you take this dark thing and turn it, you make a soap purse out of a sow's ear, essentially. What I think is true about COVID, though, is while we have been rocked both socially, epidemiologically, and politically and economically by COVID, it has been a great awakening in many ways, at least for people who are paying attention to it without the political filter. It's a tremendous shame that it's become politicized. Talk about Machiavellian. That is the ultimate Machiavellian, manifestation of COVID. But the reality is, the people who know about this, the people in the investment community who have to place bets on corporations based in part on how competently they've managed COVID, the questions about valuation of commercial real estate, questions about the relationships between employers and employees. These are all things that are very much changed in the air, I guess you could say. The future of urban areas. If you don't have to go to work, do you have to live near work? And even if you do have to go to work and the city is of a certain size, say New York or London, can you go to work during a pandemic in mass transit, right? There's all sorts of issues here that we're just beginning to unspool. And the relationship between the employer and the employee, jurisdictionally, it's different in every state in the United States, in almost every country in Europe, in every country around the world. You know, to go back to what Wayne was saying, I mean, the Biden administration will do CPR on OSHA, which is the US institute that's supposed to protect worker safety, but it still has no teeth when you come right down to it, to prevent someone from being fired because they're afraid to go to work because they have a pre-existing condition. So there's a lot of social, political, and economic dislocation that COVID has caused. I'm going to start really macro. It might not seem as relevant at the top, but I think this is a real opportunity to redefine what national security means. The Pentagon is not a player in this. In fact, if anything, they were a prominent victim. The Theodore Roosevelt, you might remember, the aircraft carrier that was shot through with COVID and really did not handle it well. And neither did the institution of the Navy or the military in the United States. National security is not just protecting against foreign invasion by a foreign army, by missiles. National security needs to be redefined as including, you know, the potential for a virus or some kind of an outbreak like this. I mean, the amount of money that the Pentagon spends on missile defense and anti-biological weapons research and biological weapons offensive research, these are the type of things that need to be looked at in kind of the same way that police budgets are being looked at. It's not a matter of canceling them. It's a matter of maybe redirecting some of that, that throw weight in military terms toward the protection of American citizens who might die from a foreign invasion by a germ or a virus. This is something that's going to take some time, but I think that's a conversation that's begun to happen. And, you know, typical of bureaucracies, there is somewhere in the Pentagon, there's some kind of, you know, constituent for this who's making the argument and trying to get a bigger budget. That's a healthy thing. That's how government works. And I hope that the public debate will support it. The other thing, the other kind of big macro thing I was thinking of is really we're looking at a concept that, you know, what you can't see actually can hurt you. And I think that's an old wives' tale. What you can't see can't hurt you. It's one of those crazy old things that my grandmother used to say when we were afraid of ghosts. But it's not true. Sorry, Granny. Ultimately, it certainly can hurt you. And it's a very important thing that we recognize that and that we pay attention to people who can come off sometimes like Chicken Little, but who have real insight into what can happen. I mean, in my own career, I had this terrible experience of being right in warning about Osama bin Laden. In the late 90s, I was covering Osama bin Laden and with a guy named Bob Windrum at NBC News. And we were told basically, almost verbatim, listen, if you can tell me bin Laden is kidnapping little blonde-haired girls, or he's training sharks off the coast of Florida to attack American swimmers, then we'll do it on nightly news. Otherwise, I'm tired of hearing his name. That was 1999. And there's an analogy to the way we handled the pandemic. I mean, Ebola was just a couple of weeks ago in historical terms, the crisis that we had here. MERS and SARS both existed. And they were real canaries in a coal mine that we ignored. So hopefully we learned from this in terms of resilience and how to deal with it. More specific to ESG though, I think we've learned that the ESG, the S in social means life. It means people. It's not necessarily well defined in our current thinking. And I think we need to really think about things. I think Wayne was the one talking about healthcare. The concept of wellness, which was a squishy thing. We started as we started to talk to people in the corporate world about facilities management data, we would run into this new entity called the Chief Wellness Officer. And it was really a kind of nice thing to see that there was such a being. That used to be the personnel director. Remember that term? Then it became human resources. But there's an interesting battle going on within large corporate organizations over who is going to control the budget that's going to be used to bring wellness to the staff, to the buildings, et cetera. It's everybody from security directors to chief counsels to HR directors to this new chief wellness officer. And we have no stake, obviously, Microshare, where that falls down. We just want someone to be thinking about it. And I think COVID has raised the reality that what happens between the four walls of your building really do matter. You need to think about that. And that extends beyond the world of the workplace, that extends into society in a very serious way. Because as you know, some of the people who have, for instance, installed the wearable contact tracing, solution that we have realized that they need to talk to their employees that this is not just to protect you at work and protect my liability concerns. This is your family. If you get this at work, we can't trace it. You bring it home to your family. This is beyond the workplace. So it's really important. I think that whole social aspect of ESG has gotten a real boost here in terms of its potential ability to be a factor. I think the environmental tends to be, the stress. It's easier in the metric sense to measure. I think that's one of the issues. So we need to really struggle with that. And that gets me to another aspect of the social. One of the things we're finding is, if in the post-COVID world, you are a large corporation, you've just had the world's greatest pilot in working from home ever, inevitably you're going to downsize your real estate footprint. It's going to be one of the great expenses that's going to take a hit. Valuations will come down no matter what my friends in commercial real estate think. There's no way you can charge the same square footage in San Francisco and New York that you were pre-COVID if no one's there. Now, having said that, think about it from an HR retention standpoint. Your best employees are basically going to say, I'm not coming to the office. I'm not going to do that. Why should I? Fire me. I'll go work for your competitor. I want to work from home. Or I'll come in 1 or 2 days a week. The inequity involved there is pretty serious because these are going to be the people you need to retain. They're going to have a very different treatment by the company than a young up and coming middle manager or a millennial who's in their second job. That's going to create inequities that mirror some of the inequities we've seen during COVID that involve females in the workforce who have had enormous burden placed on them, often for childcare, but often just for stupid traditional dogma. Ultimately, these are things that are working their way through. So these are huge social and political and economic issues that we're going to grapple with. And that brings me to the last thing I wanted to say before we turn it over to Eugene. There's an enormous problem of ossification in the way we think about sustainability metrics. This is a dangerous thing. No one expected, I almost said the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody was expecting COVID. It does not fit neatly into the productized ESG metrics that we currently look at. We've done that too quickly. It's understandable that companies that sell ESG metric services would want to, hyper differentiate and create tiny little buckets that get filled constantly by metrics. But this doesn't fit in any of it very well. And we have to be very careful not to over-productize this at this moment when we need to be learning and understanding what new metrics. And it runs right over from what my company Microshare does with new data streams that never existed before that bring facilities into a kind of a measurable quotient, right over to how do you judge the data privacy and workplace protocols that a company that puts in post-COVID to deal with the new realities. And all of these things I think are going to be very difficult to judge in an empirical way in the current filters that we have.
Do you think that a lot of those, do you see a lot of the office buildings becoming hospitals, hotels, storage places, and warehouses?
Yeah, I mean, well, what we're seeing is there's a new thing called office to residential conversion, right? And that's already something that existed in the retail space because a lot of these retail malls were being emptied out by e-commerce. There's a lot of money going into that. There's a lot of thinking being done about how do you house students and seniors in the future in a way that's sustainable. And I mean that in many ways, not just in the environmental sense, but in terms of economically. For instance, my company's involved in a test in the UK at care homes, which are their version of nursing homes, to have contact tracing bracelets on their staff and residents, because nursing homes were, really ground zero for the tragic deaths. And they're looking at this as well. Okay, once again, don't waste a crisis. Maybe there's something more when COVID diminishes that this is relevant to influenza, or it's relevant to something else that we do. Even the whole concept of a senior wandering off. So there's all sorts of thinking going on in real estate about how to adapt to this. But I think the real kind of massive question is, will people, and I'm hoping it's yes, will people still want to live in big, dense cities? And if they do, are they living there because it's close to the office, or are they living there because that's a cultural decision? The suburban office market has exploded. You've seen single family homes in suburbs exploding. I have a brother that lives in Connecticut. He can't keep people off his front stoop. They want to pay him cash for his house. And they're all people from the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So you're seeing that early kind of wave of decision-making personally and in the commercial real estate markets, but I think this hasn't played out yet. And I think there's a real hope in the commercial real estate market that they can just say, okay, that's behind us. Let's keep charging, $190 a square foot and pretend this never happened. It'll happen in 100 years again. But that, I think, is very unrealistic.